Welcome back to the Show Me the Data podcast. On today's episode, we are joined by Nicole, who is the VP of Growth Marketing at Varonis. On today's show, we'll be talking about a narrative shift that Nicole and the guys over at Varonis went through. I think it will be a really interesting one, as I know this is a topic that a lot of marketers struggle with, and also probably are either in the midst of going through or are thinking about going through it. So I think it'll be really interesting to hear how that kind of narrative transformation went, what were the learnings going through it, and I guess what gave you conviction to make that transformation, because I think that's sometimes the hardest thing to develop, with this kind of transformation. So Nicole, thank you for joining the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat about this.
Awesome. I think a great place to kick off the conversation would be, what point did you sense that a narrative change needed to happen, right? Like what were the signals where you were like, something doesn't feel quite right and like we need to make a shift?
Yeah, it was, we had tried all the other avenues, it was a newer kind of product, a newer market that we were kind of going into. And we knew the product worked really well. It was first of its kind. It solved a very common problem with this audience. At first, we thought just our database wasn't, the right audience at first. So we're like, okay, we have to grow a different audience, grow a different database to, get people talking about this. That worked relatively well, but we just weren't seeing that translate into sales. And so, we tried A/B testing, other things. And so it was just a struggle to us to kind of like, why is this not just like translating into sales? And so I had a lot of conversations with my sales team. And we just realized we were talking about it in the wrong way. And so I was like, all right, let's kind of like take a step back and maybe shift like how we're talking about, not just the product, but the problem in general. And for me, I always like to kind of test these with like a webinar. I feel like a webinar is a great way to kind of get live action responses from an audience. And so we're like, all right, let's try this webinar around this specific topic and see. And it was like our highest performing webinar registrants for that topic. And we got probably the biggest amount of people who said like, hey, like, I want to hear more. Let me talk to sales. And so I was like, all right, I think I've kind of found a solution. Now it's time to kind of like go back to the drawing board and kind of be like, okay, let's look at all of our marketing collateral around this and start rebuilding.
So that's interesting, because I feel like most would not go as bold as like doing a webinar on the big position shift. They'd wait until they've done the position shift and then go live with it. So you almost use the webinar as like a pre-validation of the narrative in a way.
Yeah, I mean, for this one, because it was slightly more niche of an audience, it's not as like big as like, if I go through my corporate webinar. So, we usually try to have that niche of an audience like once a quarter. And so we usually have that slot anyway. So it was kind of like, well, everything else is kind of, not done well. Might as well just kind of take this risk and go for it.
Mm-hmm. And what did you see, I guess, on that webinar where it, I guess, aside from people just registering and coming onto the session, were there any specific signs where you were like, okay, wow, like people are resonating with this? Is it, yeah.
Yeah, it was actually the audience that joined. So for this product, we, typically we kind of go after like chief information security officers. That's our typical kind of target audience. And originally that wasn't messaging wasn't resonating with them. And that's why we believe we had to go after more like security architects, security engineers, and they would join. But ultimately they're like, I'm not going to purchase this product for this one specific use case, but this is really interesting. I'd love if we had it, but it's, too comprehensive for just this one use case. And so we struggled with getting, chief information security officers or CISOs to join. And when we did this webinar in particular, I noticed an increase in that type of audience specifically, and they were engaging in the chat, kind of asking questions. I always feel like it's a good sign when people are very engaged in the chat and asking questions and it's super active. And then I just know like we've kind of hit a pain point or we've hit a piece that people care about.
For sure. And what, like, after that webinar happened, were there like a series of next steps then that you did to, I guess, almost further validate what was happening there? Were there conversations that were pushed to sales where they helped kind of reaffirm the direction you thought you were going in?
Yeah, exactly. I immediately kind of connected with our sales rep who's kind of in charge of that audience. And me and him kind of had a conversation. We're like, look, I think we found kind of a different message that's working. And so we worked on more of an outbound messaging strategy with his team. We're like, all right, let's kind of use his team to kind of validate some of these conversations, get some, feedback from how that's working. And he started seeing the same thing. Obviously, he had a bump of people who are interested in in talking about next steps around this product from the webinar. So we're like, all right, we just talked about it, obviously resonated, use this new outbound messaging to see like how it works. And he saw that people were much more interested in the product. We, generated pipeline a lot faster, which was something that we had been struggling, kind of like getting new opportunities for this product line in the pipeline. And now all of a sudden we had an influx of people who were like, yep, I want to see, an eval. I want to test it out. Let's go.
Mm-hmm. And I guess just going back like two steps for a second, why was the positioning, I guess, like not, or the narrative not hitting before, and what was the shift that you made? I know it'll be kind of in the weeds relative to Varonis, but I think it's still interesting for the audience to hear.
Yeah, definitely. So it was our product around Salesforce. And so a lot of people, no one really aren't sure who owns security when it comes to Salesforce is what we discovered was the problem. So, CISOs just kind of assumed, the Salesforce architects, they handled it. Salesforce architects actually were just like, that is just not my, priority. I've got a million other priorities. And so we discovered that there's actually this like gap, like the security gap. And so we pushed into that problem. We're like, hey, do you realize that, there's kind of the security gap in your, your tech stack and your cybersecurity posture that you might not be thinking about? And we can help solve it along with, XYZ. And it was more of just like identifying an area that, CISOs weren't really thinking about, the security architects weren't really thinking about, and being like, here's how we can solve it where it makes it easy for both of you. So you guys don't have to like think about it, but it's protected. And that's when we found like that was the sweet spot. And it was more of like educating the market on that this is a security problem. Most people do have Salesforce. And so it's like, are you even thinking about your Salesforce security and where your data, what's happening with your data in, this CRM?
I've heard from a lot of people, a lot of marketers, that CISOs are inherently difficult to sell to. Like they are very difficult personas to get in front of, get their attention, and convince them, of a problem and that you have the solution to that. What have been your learnings from selling to this audience, through this narrative shift, but just more broadly, like what are some of the key takeaways of trying to get in front of that specific persona?
Yeah, CISOs definitely can smell BS from a mile away. So they hate marketing jargon. They hate anything that, smells like marketing. So you really do have to kind of come in just very direct and, don't put any marketing fluff on it. As a marketer, we always like to get creative. We like to have fun, throw in some puns, and, there's a time and place for it. But usually what I've seen resonate the best is just like straight, dry, to the point, like, hey, we're going to talk about XYZ. Come join here. It's going to be this many minutes long. And then at the end, like there's no, obligation for you, like kind of just being super straight and direct about what they can expect. And then just showing off your expertise. I think they really prefer if you obviously know what you're talking about, you're, just not doing, like I said, they can smell marketing a mile away. So like we usually lean on content from our threat labs research or experts in the field rather than, myself writing a blog, because I'm not a cybersecurity expert, but I'm the marketing expert. So leaning on the expertise and being super direct has worked well for us.
Yeah, I guess it probably like forces you to lean into a lot more research-backed, data-backed content and a lot more like longer form content, I imagine, to kind of really build the trust with that persona.
Yeah, they definitely value, building that trust, knowing that you kind of know their world. CISOs, I think, are some of the most marketed to people in the world as well. And so, you have to kind of stand out from the noise a little bit and, really help solve a problem that they're having and be seen as a valuable asset. And then once, CISOs believe in you, they're like some of your strongest advocates, which is great. So like once you kind of bring them in, they're some of your most loyal customers, because if you can solve a problem and make them look like a hero, they're going to stick with you through thick and thin, which you could see when there's actually like that CrowdStrike breach, and everything went through that. And it was interesting because CISOs still stayed very loyal, to CrowdStrike, because they were just like, they solved these problems. We didn't really see a shift in like the industry conversation that they were like going to leave that company.
It's interesting. I think there was like a chatter for a week, and then I think it quickly kind of fizzled out, because I imagine they've got a really good reputation in the space. So
and they solved it and covered the patched
they were very
pretty quickly
public about it. They were open about it, which I think is the PR around it was very good on corporate side. Just going back to the shift, I guess post that webinar and post, I guess, discovering that this was the kind of direction of travel to go in with the narrative, what did that process then look like? Did you then have to go and get buy-in from from above to go and say, hey, this is the direction we want to go in? We validate it with the webinar. What did that kind of validation process look like?
Yeah, for me, it was, I'm lucky enough where I'm kind of in charge of a lot of the messaging. So if I kind of want to test things, I'm able to kind of just move forward.
Yeah.
So since I had these kind of initial validations, aligned with sales, was seeing those resonate, I was able to kind of next steps, like go to the website, start, changing the copy on there, seeing how that was working, and building, demand gen campaigns and kind of testing them out. I'm lucky enough where I'm able to kind of just make the move if I want to, and then just report up and say like, hey, we're seeing, XYZ in terms of percentages, especially because after that webinar, I think we saw like a 20% increase in new opportunities from this product line. People weren't going to argue with me if they were like, yeah, continue to kind of see that increase. So yeah, I was fortunate enough to just kind of like be able to move fast, which is something we're lucky at Varonis. We're able to kind of be scrappy and move fast, and there's not tons of red tape.
I imagine there's like a lot of marketers listening that are also, they may be asking maybe more tactically, what does that narrative shift look like? What are the first assets that you go and change? Do you focus first on the sales assets and kind of changing how sales are pitching things? Do you change some of like the top of the funnel awareness? Like what does the actual tactics look like of the shift?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, for me, first, I kind of almost write what that narrative looks like in like a one pager or a few paragraphs or something to help internally kind of communicate it. And I think sometimes doing that exercise helps you create like, what's the problem? What's the solution? What's the story we're going to tell? And it helps, when I share it with my team, they're able to kind of duplicate that pretty easily. And so that's kind of my first piece. And then I, start sharing that internally with sales, with my marketing team and everyone else, and say like, this is the story we need to tell. This is why. And now use your kind of area of expertise to help share that story. So that's the first part. Then secondly, it's like, okay, let's look at our high level, external assets. So obviously, our landing pages, our website pages that talk about this, any email nurtures that we have going on, redo those. And then looking at our advertising campaigns that we're doing and shift those as well. And then also working with sales to make sure like their outbound messaging is the same as what we're saying.
Got it. So it's more internal first, and then you shift it more to external with the ads and the outbound messaging as a kind of second layer.
Yeah, I find that, doing that internal work kind of feels like, you're not making progress, and it feels, like, but it helps with the, the scalability
the
of
groundwork.
it. Yeah, exactly. Before, if you move too fast and you're the only person kind of doing it, then you find other people are talking, in the old messaging, especially because I handle global. It's very hard to make sure, Europe's also talking the same language we are in North America, and making sure they're all, saying the same messaging. So, yeah, I feel like even though it doesn't feel like it's making progress, it's a really crucial step that sometimes gets missed.
You just mentioned that. I think it'd be interesting. So obviously, Europe, US, different markets. Was that a concern, and is this a concern for you, where you think, okay, we've validated the shift in one market, but perhaps it won't resonate or land in Europe or a different market? Is there a process that you have to also go through to kind of validate it in each new market, for example, Europe versus the US?
Yeah, definitely. So similarly, that first webinar we did was a global, corporate one. So there's a mix, but we do, then test it in the different regions as well, because we have multiple times seen, like what resonates in North America doesn't resonate over in France, So we usually test it similarly where we'll run a European specific webinar or a UK or French webinar around that topic and see how it goes. We do see, certain countries or regions react to different topics slightly differently. So this one in particular, I think, it resonated pretty well in EMEA, but not so much in like APAC. So we're like, all right, we're going to continue kind of growing, this in Europe and have this be a focus, but in APAC, we're going to kind of shift to something else. We're not going to kind of keep pushing it. It just wasn't like a key concern for that region.
Got it. Yeah, I remember working with a couple of years ago a French legal tech company, and the narrative that they were leading with in the French market made a lot of sense. The market was a lot less mature. They weren't really using a lot of tech, so it was quite a simplistic narrative that they were able to lead with. I remember then the CEO they were trying to get kind of them push into the I think it was either the UK or the US. And he just did not land at all. Way more competitive, way more sophisticated buyers. And I think it's just an important point of two markets are not the same.
Yeah, very true.
Yes.
Yeah, we found similar where like, markets where maybe we're not as mature, we kind of have to have that more broad strokes conversation where, North America, we're very mature here. And so you do kind of have to nail into the nitty gritty, different areas of cybersecurity.
100%. So I guess post shift, what were some of the, I guess, both qualitative but then also more quantitative metrics that you saw of this narrative shift across the business?
Yeah, my favorite one that's not data driven was just before this felt like such a pain point with the business where they're just like, this isn't selling, it just feels like we're pushing a rock up a hill and it's not going anywhere. And then probably around like a year, maybe 8 months after we kind of made this shift, I was in a room with our CEO and we weren't even talking about this at all, but all of a sudden he's like, oh, it's just so easy to sell this product now. Sales really figured it out. And I kind of laughed because I was just like, yeah, sure, sales figured it out, but there's definitely a hand in the messaging. But the fact that it felt so easy to kind of sell this product now because we had kind of found the problem, shifted the messaging we were saying to it, and now it just feels like it's like a no-brainer for our sales to sell the product. That was like my biggest win. But more data driven. We did see like obviously we had a spike that first quarter. I think we saw like 22 to 25% increase in new opportunities coming through. But since then we've just kind of seen like a steady increase quarter over quarter, probably like 18 to 20% increase in new opportunities. And we're getting about, 15 to 20% of new business deals closing, which is great. So now it's becoming like one of our easiest sells. It's a growing kind of product line within like our suite of things. And so it's definitely like an area we're continuing to kind of grow and invest in now.
Awesome. Yeah. So my follow-up was going to be, was it an immediate transition with the sales? But it sounds like it was like first quarter, 20% up. So I think it was a very immediate shift.
Yeah, they definitely had a spike from that. And then we kind of continued to kind of just lean into that. And now that it's selling so much easier, it's easier to kind of make bigger investments and continue to kind of grow that product line.
100%. I follow one of my favorite follows on LinkedIn is a guy called Jay Barron. He kind of talks a lot about this narrative shift and how it's a lot of B2B marketers and a lot of teams really underlook and undervalue the importance of just shifting the narrative, right? Like shifting the position, but shifting the narrative. And I think it's very true, right? Like we as I think sometimes as marketers, we jump to the more obvious ways to make shifts when actually it's like what we're saying to the market that is the biggest problem. Do you feel like it's severely underlooked by most teams?
I think so. I think especially as like a growth tactic. I feel like, a lot of people, they think of growth or demand gen and they're just like, they think of tactics like in terms of like campaigns and like, I'm going to put in LinkedIn or I'm going to, put in email nurture or something. And I think sometimes they think, messaging and positioning is either like a product marketing problem to solve, which they definitely have a big hand in it, don't get me wrong, or like a branding thing. And it's like, no, actually, like, I think there is a piece of, this within growth. Like if you do get the messaging right, like it can help scale I saw firsthand. And so I do think it's something that's slightly overlooked. But I do feel like it's something that kind of has to come like top down. It's going to be harder if you're like an individual contributor, maybe just like a marketing manager in a larger, scale organization, I feel like it's probably harder to kind of convince the higher ups that like, oh, instead of running a new LinkedIn campaign, I think we need to relook at my strategic narrative. They might, not love that kind of feedback, but I do think like holistically, it is something that as marketers, we should be thinking about more.
And you did this all internally, right? I think for most marketers, or I've heard a lot as well that it's usually something that has to come from the CEO, really, to do like a strategic narrative overhaul. Do you think that's true, or actually it can be done by a marketer, a team, within the company?
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily true. Obviously, each company is different, but I do think it should be like a little bit more marketing led. Um, yeah, I think like, I'm fortunate in this instance that it was a small kind of niche area. So it's like a perfect place to experiment and test. That's not going to, be detrimental to the business. Obviously, if you start talking about the strategic narrative from a larger brand piece, that's definitely going to get a lot more opinions and you're going to need some red tape approvals.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think it's interesting. I think generally, when you're working in a bigger co, where there are more, smaller product changes you can make, or like, product lines, then it makes more sense. Whereas I think if you're at a smaller startup stage, then it's probably better coming in a combination from the founder and the marketing leader.
Yeah. And I guess, if you are like listening to this and you're like, well, I'd love to do this, but like, I don't have that kind of power or say, there might be smaller ways you can kind of prove and show, like, through A/B testing, like maybe if you are in charge of creating LinkedIn ads or display advertising, you could try to test some tweaks, on a smaller percentage. And then you can bring that to your boss and say like, hey, we're seeing really good success from this. Should we talk about it?
100%. I mean, I think even, the idea of basically using the webinar as the validation tool for the narrative, I think is really smart. I don't think a lot of people would maybe go to that extent to try and
take that risk.
Yeah. Take that risk, or like, do that. Because it does feel like quite a big step to make, but actually makes a ton of sense, because you're going to learn on that session if it does or doesn't resonate. And actually you'll learn quite quickly, because people will either show up or they won't show up.
Yes. Exactly.
So it works really well.
Like luckily, we run quite a few webinars, so I have other things in my back pocket to like make up if it's a failure, and we've definitely had failures when it comes to webinars.
For sure.
But yeah, there's definitely ways to test, and sometimes it's good to like take that risk, because I think that helped make more of an immediate impact on pipeline and growth, because we took that big of a risk. Where if I did a little bit smaller, I might have taken more time, and I might not have felt as confident that that was the reason that was kind of helping change anything.
One like closing question I've got is, I think sometimes like narrative, it feels a little bit like sometimes the conversation around and it's completely slipped my mind now. Let me just where was I going with this? Product, what is it called? Validating a product. One second. It's completely
go ahead.
Completely slipped. It's happens sometimes. Product market fit. That was the word I was looking for. Then I just click back in. So sometimes I think product market fit and narrative, they can be put in the same bucket a little bit when it comes to kind of validating one or the other. Do you kind of think that with something like a narrative shift, should it be an immediate, like, it resonates or it doesn't resonate? Is there a waiting time that you can kind of give it? Or do you think when you make this kind of shift, it's very obvious on day one if it does or doesn't resonate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think for us, I knew it wasn't a product market fit because the people who were using it loved it. And it was just like, how do we kind of get more people aware of this? And so we knew we had the product market fit, and it was just like we weren't telling the right story to get more people interested in it. But I would say, with marketing, I would say it should not have as much immediate impact. Like, you do have to give things time, and you do have to let things bake, and don't give up on things too quickly. But definitely looking for, more of those top of funnel, or maybe, less data driven indicators. That's why I love having conversations with the sales team. I feel like sometimes that's like my quickest validation, even if it's not, resonating into pipeline. You kind of just hear from, the conversations they're having, like, is this working? Oh yeah, the leads are getting better that we're having conversations, and or they're coming in with the problems that, highlight this product, even though they're not, maybe converting into opportunities. I think that sometimes just conversations with sales or listening to sales calls is just like the best way to kind of just feel if it's going in the right direction before you start seeing that resonate into like your pipeline.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's at that stage, it's a lot more of a qualitative thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Anything else? Yeah, 100%. Nicole, this was a really, really interesting episode. I really appreciate you coming on, and yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Okay, guys, we will see you on the next episode of the Show Me the Data podcast. See ya.